Well, it's 7 o'clock. I think we can get started. I can't get my video to work, so I'm hoping you're seeing the slides, and that's good enough for me. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. For the next 30 minutes, we'll be doing a glimpse of Milwaukee through its advertising covers. And this talk is being given in conjunction with Milcopex, one of a series of three. I'd like to thank the Milwaukee Philatelic Society for sponsoring and underwriting Milcopex, and thank Colin Frazier for his Zoom hosting. And let everyone know that Colin will be presenting tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central Time on exhibiting. So I want to mention how I got started. I moved to Milwaukee in the mid-'70s. And before I moved here, I had a couple jobs in industry. And then when I moved here, I had a job that exposed me to a lot of different industries. And when I moved here, I was a stamp collector. But because I was exposed to so many industries, all of a sudden I got involved in the industrial history of Milwaukee because it's really fascinating. And a lot of big companies were founded here. And up until the 70s and 80s, the industrial base in this city was huge. So one of the early covers that I picked up was the one on this slide from Johnson Electric Service Company, which is now Johnson Controls. And the cover's nice enough. And but there was an enclosure, and it was a letter from Paul Johnson to his wife back in Philadelphia. Paul Johnson was the son of Warren Johnson. And the letter just says, "Hi, sweetheart. It's nice here." He talks about his father. He talks about shoveling snow. So it's kind of an innocuous letter, but it really got me going on industrial covers and industrial advertising covers. Here's a couple covers that show the lakefront from the 1890s. And I know you can't read what's in the lower left, but what both these covers say is it in the 1890s had a population of 260,000, the lowest death rate, whatever that means, 3,560 factories, which I find extremely hard to believe, 53,873 people employed, machine works, breweries, and tanneries. On the map here shows Milwaukee at that time, and I know you can't, it's real difficult to see, but this is the Lake Michigan on the right, the what is now currently the downtown, and I have a couple of red squares there. And just to give you an idea of how much industry was focused in this area, in the upper red square, all those little black squares are tanneries. Right on the river, they need a lot of water to tan leather. So you can imagine the environmental damage that was done. But that gives you an idea. There's probably 10 or 12 tanneries. The lower square are grain elevators, of course, on the river. And all the canals that were built then, offshoots of the river, all supported industry. Most of the industry was down on the south side of town, and where people could walk, just a huge concentration of industry in Milwaukee. So, of course, Milwaukee's known for brewing and beer. The cover here is Schlitz, and beer that made Milwaukee famous. The reason it made Milwaukee famous is because a lot of beer was supplied to the city of Chicago after their Chicago fire of 1871, and Schlitz was a huge supplier. Like all the breweries in town, production waned. Production of Schlitz ended in Milwaukee in 1981, although it's still subcontracted through various breweries. Pabst is, of course, Pabst. Pabst, one of their claims to fame is they introduced the first lager beer to Milwaukee. It was Best Brewing until 1844, and not because it was the best brewery, but because it was owned by the Best family. In the 1890s, Maria Best, who at that time was the owner of the brewery, married Frederick Pabst, and he changed the name to Pabst Brewing. Miller Brewing, founded in 1855, by purchasing the Plank Road Brewery. The photo on the lower left is a later picture of the Plank Road Brewery, but you can see the hills and tunnels built into the hills to form the refrigeration systems that were used back then. And then a photo on the right is a picture of the bottling line at that time, in the 1920s, 1930s, a later picture. Blatz was one of the middle-sized breweries in town. The upper cover is from 1876, and that is the first commemorative stamped envelope that was produced by the Post Office Department, and that commemorated the American Centennial. The lower cover is a newer cover from the 1920s. Probably the biggest claim to fame for Blatz is they were the first one in Milwaukee to sell bottled beer. And the picture of the bottle in the upper right is an example of the type of the first bottle used for beer. It wasn't long after these clay bottles went out that they were able to make clear glass bottles with the cork and the wire assembly that would be more recognizable today. This is just a quick rundown of 1891, how the breweries ranked. Pabst was by far the biggest, Schlitz, Blatz. We'll talk about Falk in a little bit, but he was a Middle Brewing, and then Miller, and then Gettleman. So I'd like to touch on manufacturing a little bit. I'm going to cover breweries, manufacturing, food, and then celebrations. Really hit them real fast because I've got a lot of covers, and we'll touch on a little bit of history as we go along. So Edward Alice of Alice Chalmers fame owned a foundry called the Reliance Work that he named the Reliance Work. The lower right cover is from 1883, a cover from the Reliance Works. The upper cover is a cameo cover from Bay State Foundries from the 1850s. That foundry was purchased by E.P. Alice, by Edward Alice, and incorporated into the Reliance Works in the 1870s. Falk, known today for machine shop and for their gear making. They're famous for their gear making, but their first product was actually a mobile casting system that rode along the streetcar rails, and they could repair the rails without the manual labor that was previously needed. In the past, people would get out there, cut out the rail section, put in a new rail, weld it up. Falk designed a system that could ride on the rails and do it in place and with a mobile system. So I mentioned Falk before when I was talking about breweries. Falk had a brewery in the Menominee River Valley, somewhere near Pigsville, what's called Pigsville now. And that brewery burned down twice. And after the second time, Falk sold his property to Pabst and went further east and developed the machine shop that's still there today. The company's still headquartered in Milwaukee. A couple of companies that maybe you haven't heard of, Chain Belt Company and Nordberg. Chain Belt was a builder of conveyor components, and that's one of them shown on the upper cover, and mainly used by the breweries. Their most famous product was called the Rex Chain Belt. So in the 1880s, Bruno Nordberg started up a machine shop, Nordberg Manufacturing, and those two went along for decades and decades. In 1973, Chain Belt and Nordberg combined to form Rex Nord, which is still in Milwaukee today in a little different form than it used to be. I worked for Rex Nord right out of school in the late 1970s. Evinrude, the Ole Evinrude was a early internal combustion guy. He helped design the carburetors for Harley Davidson. He worked for E.P. Alice, who I mentioned earlier. He's known as the father of the Lawn Boy lawnmower. The legend has it that he was on Party Island in Okauchee Lake, which is over by Oconomowoc, and he and an employee who he later married, Bess Carey, were enjoying the day. Bess wanted some ice cream. So Ole rode, and it's not too far from the island to the shore. He rode from the island to the shore, bought the ice cream, rode back, And by that time, of course, the ice cream was melted. And that gave him the idea that he needed to build a outboard motor that would fit on a canoe or a rowboat. And that picture of the motor there is one of his early motors. I think it's from 1911 or early 19 teens. Harley Davidson, this is the only old Harley Davidson cover I have. I have never found another one, not in any auction catalogs. I would love to see one. The company was founded in 1903 in that little garage that's in the lower right. In 1907, they incorporated, but they built a real factory in 1905. They were only in that little shed for a couple of years. The cover there is from 1911, shows one of their early motorcycles. The series of special delivery stamps from the 1920s depicts Harley Davidson motorcycles. And then there's a later US 39-cent. There was a series of motorcycle stamps with Harley Davidson depicted. There are a lot of Harley Davidson stamps around the world, have been many, from many different countries. Milwaukee has been known for years as the cream city. And a lot of people think it's because of the dairy industry in Wisconsin. It's not. It's because when you take the clay from the shore of Lake Michigan and turn it into bricks and you fire that bricks, it turns into that color, that light tan cream city brick color. George Burnham, who has a canal and a street in Milwaukee named after him, invented a machine that was able to, steam-powered machine that was able to form and fire bricks. And that's depicted on that cover there. Couple slides on food companies. Here's a couple companies most people will know, Cudahy Brothers and Usinger. Cudahy Brothers built their stockyard and slaughterhouse down what is now Cudahy. Back then it was unincorporated. They built their factory and the railroad put a train stop there and called it Cudahy, and the city grew up around that, and to this day it's called Cudahy. The Usinger store and the Usinger plant is in the same location that it was when it was founded in the 1870s, down on what is now Old World 3rd Street. So if you go into that store to buy some Usinger product, you're standing in the same location where the plant was in the 1800s. A couple more companies that people know: Ambrosia Chocolate and Red Star Yeast. Ambrosia Chocolate was founded in 1894, and it was located on part of what is now the Fiserv Forum parking lot, one of the parking lots near the Fiserv Forum. The Red Star Yeast plant was on, I believe, 16th and just south of what is now the freeway. I put these two companies together on this slide because anybody that's lived in Milwaukee through the 70s and 80s will remember driving downtown on the freeway and hitting those wicked smells. And on certain days when the smell of the chocolate and the yeast combined, it would be potent and pretty obnoxious. At least to me it was. Some people said, oh, that sweet smell of bread. Well, that's not the way I found it. Red Star Yeast closed their plant in 2005 and built a big plant down in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And the Ambrosia Chocolate plant was moved out to the northwest side, somewhere around 90th and Brown Deer in that industrial park out there, and is now owned by Cargill. For anybody that's from Milwaukee, one of Ambrosia's claims to infamy is they were the employer of Jeffrey Dahmer. Ziegler Chocolates was a famous candy company for over 100 years in Milwaukee, and they were located in what is now an apartment building. That's the top picture there. Run by 4 generations of the Ziegler family. The 5th generation did not continue the candy business, but they opened a retail store called Half Nuts, which is in West Dallas. And you can still buy the giant bar there, which was one of Ziegler's famous products in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. We'll touch on consumer goods real quick. A couple of old covers from the 1860s, both printed by the same lithographer, L. Lippman in Milwaukee. Northwestern Mutual Life is still a very large presence in Milwaukee. They've got a brand new office building, an older office building, plus I understand they're now building an apartment building for employees. The Spencerian Business College, not a very attractive cover. It's old, but they were located on the corner of what is now Wisconsin Avenue and Broadway. And the reason I put this cover is because my mother went there. She went to the Spencerian Business College for business school in the late 40s and early 50s and got her degree. Then she moved up to Neenah, where I was born, got married, worked for a bank for years. So, like I say, not a great cover, but it's got a history. This cover is called a billboard cover, and there are 32 different companies represented on the reverse of this cover, only 4 of which I have full covers for. And as near as I can tell, I couldn't find much on billboard covers in general. This is the only Milwaukee billboard cover I've ever seen. But from what I understand, Miller, the company represented on the front, sold or subsidized his printing by advertising, having these small advertisings on the reverse. And he probably needed to do that since he sold hair, which I can't imagine was extremely popular. Elves and Brownies. The Durant Company used brownies as their mascot or their logo. Cream City Sash and Door used elves. Brownies are Scottish or English in origin, and elves are Germanic. Both of them, going back into the 1800s, had the same reputation: mischievous, supernatural, troublemakers. And you don't see much of that any day, but up through the 20s and the 50s, there was a character, Billy the Brownie, and he was a presence every year in Milwaukee during Christmas time. And later in that period, he became the Schuster department store mascot, if you want to call it that. And there were radio shows and TV commercials, and Billy the Brownie is well known to us old people. This isn't really an advertising cover, it's a wrapper. C.N. Casper owned a bookstore, Germanic dual language bookstore, and he wrote a couple books, Milwaukee Atlas, Technical German English Dictionary, and ran his bookstore. And I like this wrapper, sent to Germany, 15-cent Colombian sole use. I assume it's proper postage, so it's a nice wrapper. There are a lot of collectors of gun covers. Gun covers are very attractive, printed by a lot of different gun companies, showing a lot of different hunting scenes. And here the old frontierman, woman with a gun and a Remington. And the upper cover is John Meunier, who is a gun maker and a gun seller in Milwaukee. The picture of the gun to the right is one of his guns, and that is from the Milwaukee Public Museum collection. And the lower cover is Pritzlaff Hardware. They were a retail and wholesale hardware company in Milwaukee. The gun covers are crazy expensive just because they're so popular and so many people collect them. Gessler's Magic Headache Wafers. The bottom cover is a Spanish-American War cover, very typical format for a Spanish-American War cover with the stars and stripes. What's different about this one is it has the advertising in the stars, which is unusual. Almost all of them that have advertising have the advertising below the stars in the stripes. You can see Gessler's Magic Headache Wafer advertised on the top cover as well. Headaches cured in 20 minutes. I did some research on Gessler, and almost all the research I found had him in one lawsuit after another. So I'm sure his patent medicine, his magic headache wafers were a combination of caffeine and acetanilide, which is a legitimate analgesic, but I think he probably oversold his product and it didn't work quite as well as he had hoped. Lindsay Brothers, almost anybody that collects Milwaukee advertising covers has a lot of Lindsay Brothers covers. They are colorful. They were produced in multiple colors. I like this one, and I put it in the talk because one of the reasons is it's got a perfin. You can see the stamp in the upper right has LB, stands for Lindsay Brothers. The perfin stands for perforated initials, and companies perforated their stamps like that to prevent employee pilferage. The photo on the bottom is a picture I took a couple years ago. The building still stands on South 2nd Street. That used to be Reed Street. And I know you can't see it on the picture, but there's an archway on the very top of the building that says Lindsay Brothers 1898 when the building was built. It was a hardware store, and they moved there in 1892 into that building, and their descendants operated as a hardware store until 1989. Now it's an office building. HHS with a picture of a desk. I put this cover in because when I was going to school at Marquette, the HHS store was right on the bus route, so I'd stop there. But most of my office supplies at HHS. That was before the time of Amazon and before the time of Office Depot and that sort of thing. They got bought out by U.S. Office Products in the 1990s, so they were in business a good long time. This cover I just picked up, and the cover isn't really anything special. Phoenix suspender. I did a little research, and the suspenders they made were primarily to hold up socks, not to hold up pants, which I found kind of interesting. But the reason I bought the cover is you see the return to sender hands that are on the cover that are hand drawn in pencil. And I didn't know if they were added later or added for some phony decoration. The lower return to sender is the more conventional hand stamp. If an item in the mail is sent to someone who moved or died, the cover is typically returned to sender, and there's some marking to that effect. Well, there's a database of postal markings that I found, and that database includes quite a few hand-drawn return to sender markings like this one. Some of them are fancier, some of them are not quite as fancy, but I was surprised I had never heard of that before. Here's another form of advertising. Straw and Ellsworth made knit goods, mittens, caps, gloves, that sort of thing. What a company would do is they would purchase the postal stationery, or they would have an envelope printed with a square for the stamp, and then they would take it to a printer and have their advertising collar, it's called an advertising collar, have their collar printed around either the square or the postal stationery marking. Hotels real quickly. Last night in Rob's talk, for those of you that there was right at the end, there was a discussion of Milwaukee versus Milwaukee, the IE versus the EE. In 1935, Solomon Juneau was the first postmaster. He spelled Milwaukee with an IE. The subsequent postmasters who were Republican or Whig liked the EE spelling, and when a Democratic postmaster came in, he changed all the hand stamps to EE. To IE. So it kept going back and forth from 1835 until 1862, when, for whatever reason, they settled on EE, and it's been that way ever since. Someone mentioned yesterday the Milwaukee, Oregon, that's spelled with an IE, and I should know the guy's name. I forgot the guy's name, but a Milwaukee native moved out to Oregon in the 1850s. And at that time, he started a city called Milwaukee with an IE, and it's still that way today. Newhall House was a luxury hotel down on Michigan and Broadway. It's again a hotel now, a modern hotel, but it was a hotel started in 1850s. Oh, there it says 1857. Daniel Newhall started it, and in 1883 it burned to the ground. And the reason it's important in Milwaukee history is it gave a start to the Milwaukee Journal because they wrote a series of expose articles, and those articles actually really strengthened the fire code in Milwaukee. So you'll see subsequent advertising covers for hotels that'll use the word fireproof. And that's a result of those regulations, those ordinances that were put in place. That fire killed about 75 people. And one of the Newhall houses claims to fame is that in 1859, Abraham Lincoln stayed there. And he, the next day, gave a talk at the state fair. It was called the Ag Fair at that time, but it was on the grounds of what is now Marquette University, 13th Street in Wells. That was in 1859. A couple of covers on celebrations in 1898 to celebrate the state's semi-centennial, the Blue Angel cover, and that name was given, as near as I can tell, that name was given by Dan Shilkrat, who wrote an article in 1999 in the American Philatelist, and he identified over 70 different companies and governmental agencies that had their names printed on these envelopes. And because of the demand was so great, it had to go through 5 printings, and you can tell which printing it is by how the name Kramer Engineering, Kramer Engraving on the bottom, where that's positioned, you can tell which printing it is. In 1999, the Milwaukee Philatelic Society used that design for their show cover for Milcopex. You'll see a lot of covers that are, where was I? I lost track here. The Blue Angel cover that I just discussed, that I was looking at the wrong slide. Covers now commemorate what? They commemorate stamp shows, they commemorate a few different things, but back here in 1901, 1913, they were used to commemorate a lot of things because, like the term advertising cover says, it was a primary form of advertising for events, for companies, for even individuals, for clubs. Here's one for Wisconsin State Fair from 1913. And shortly before this, it moved out to its permanent location out near Wauwatosa, where it is now. State Fair began in 1851, moved around the state, originally in Janesville, but moved around in 1892. It finally found its home out in what are now state fairgrounds. 3 more covers for Elks Convention. I point these out just because they're, again, sponsored covers. You can see sponsored by 3 different companies. The upper cover commemorates 1886 Sangerfest. Sangerfest translated roughly to Festival of Singers. And then the Milwaukee Jahrmarkt, again, another German celebration in 1902. And Jahrmarkt roughly translated into Fun Fest. Very colorful cover. Washington Park Zoo, designed by Frederick Olmsted, along with a bunch of other Milwaukee County parks. Began in 1892. At that time, it was called West Park Zoo, and now Washington Park. Of course, the park was the old style with small cages. The zoo originally just had a deer herd, an eagle, several bears, all in cages. And by 1920, the zoo was the 5th largest in the country, but it was the old style. And so starting in the 40s, they talked about building a new zoo that had more room for the animals, a little more diverse environment. And that's in the 1950s, the zoo out on Blue Mountain Road was constructed. Washington Park is still Washington Park. It's just not a zoo anymore. The Cosmopolitan Correspondence Club was short-lived, started in 1900, built up, just like the name implies. It was really a group of pen pals that corresponded around the world, founded in Milwaukee, and at one point it had over 6,000 members in over 100 different countries. But as near as I can tell, based on, I spent quite a bit of time on that, seemed like it died out in World War I. I don't know if people stopped corresponding because of the censors, or I'm not quite sure, but seemed to die out fast. So we'll conclude here, I hope I'm on time, with the Old Settlers Club. And I know you can't read the text, but the Old Settlers Club was founded in 1869, and the club was only open to men who settled Milwaukee County before 1839. Well, obviously, by the 1880s, almost everybody was dying off. So then they expanded their ranks and decided to admit the sons of anyone who arrived before 1843. Well, that allowed the Old Settlers Club to last into the next century, but they died after that. Now, one of their mandates was to develop a history of Milwaukee, and it wasn't the normal history like you see in a textbook. There are volumes and volumes and volumes of reminiscences, everyday life, and those are all stored at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. Very interesting. I've glanced through some of them and read some of the entries. If you're looking for anything in particular, it's really tough to find, but it tells you what life was like in the 1840s, 50s, 60s in Milwaukee. So I thank you for your time. If there are any questions, I want to thank Milwaukee Philatelic Society again for having us. I hope they got their electronics working over there to be able to view this. The presentation will be recorded, and it'll be put up on the Milcopex website probably early next week, as soon as I get all the recordings and get them edited and get them put up. So if you want to re-listen to this, or you missed Rob's last night or Colin's tomorrow, or any of the presentations during the show, they'll be up on the Milcopex website. So thank you very much.